Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Kendra Matthews, a Senior Product Marketing Manager at Conversica, and I'm joined by Amanda DePaul, a marketing consultant and a former Conversican. Amanda, you want to take a minute to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. I am a consultant. I work with Conversica. I previously led demand gen at Conversica, and now I am working with Conversica and a few other SaaS companies as a marketing consultant.
Great, thanks, Amanda. So today we want to talk to you a little bit about how to complement your existing nurture strategy with conversational AI. So what is conversational AI? It's a technology that enables people and computers to communicate with each other in two-way personalized dialogue that mimics the natural back and forth of a conversation. Leveraging conversational AI enables marketing and sales to scale that personalized outreach like never before and generates real dialogue with your audience. It moves leads through the funnel faster than ever before. This personalized dialogue helps drive better engagement, and we all know better engagement drives more revenue. But before I start the conversation with Amanda, I want to take a moment to tell you a little bit more about Conversica. Conversica is a conversational AI solution. In fact, we're a pioneer in the industry, having been around for over 13 years. Conversica AI assistants help organizations attract, acquire, and grow customers at scale across the entire customer revenue lifecycle. So what does that really mean? Our AI assistants act as digital team members working alongside your marketing, sales, and customer success organizations to engage prospects and customers in human-like two-way conversations. These assistants complement their human counterparts with persistent and personalized engagement, offloading many of the routine and repetitive tasks required to increase participation in events, qualify leads, set up meetings, communicate product announcements, just to name a few. But not all AI solutions are created equal. When it comes to AI, experience matters. The sophistication of the engine and the maturity of the learning models equate to better outcomes. Here at Conversica, we have a 98% accuracy rate with over 1 billion interactions. And our 3,400 AI assistants that are in market have generated over $20 billion in revenue for our customers. But this all comes back to conversational AI and how it helps to drive better engagement. So with that said, Amanda, how is engagement defined these days?
Yeah, I think, today engagement still is sort of defined traditionally, where when we think about nurture and we think about like the campaigns that we run as demand gen professionals, we're thinking about engagement in the way of visits and opens and clicks, and maybe from a social perspective we're thinking about likes and shares and things like that. But that's still very one way, right? It's still very we send something to you and then you engage with it, and we call that like success. You clicked on it. That to me isn't necessarily engagement. I think that we have to think about engagement a little bit differently, especially with this kind of like digital first world that we're living in, where really just a click or a share or a like really doesn't tell you anything about the level of interest somebody has in actually talking to you. And I think that, when you think about it, even from like a nurture perspective, and you're thinking about emails that you're sending out to people, nobody ever really talks about things like reply rates, because most often the marketing emails you're sending aren't necessarily generating real replies. So I think that there's kind of like a leveling up to engagement that needs to happen from this kind of like sort of passive behavioral measurement and calling that success versus like this real tangible, engagement in the way of like conversations and back and forth that we should be generating that actually does yield real deals and opportunities at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, here at Conversica, we actually do an annual study that really talks about what effective engagement might look like, especially when you're talking about conversations and dialogues. You want to talk a little bit about this, Amanda?
Yeah. And so, it's interesting because, we really rely on SDRs and salespeople to really drive engagement as far as the kind of engagement that I'm talking about, where we're saying, conversations and real dialogue constitutes engagement. That really falls on sales. And the issue is that there are a lot of different components and a lot of different qualities and things that have to happen in order to drive that engagement from a sales team. And a lot of that is really hard to scale. And so in our study, we look at a bunch of different companies, and we basically kind of secret shop them, and we measure how good they are at executing their follow-up against the 4 Ps. And our 4 Ps are persistence, promptness, personalization, and performance. And the idea is you really need to nail all 4 of these in order to generate real, true engagement with your audience. And what we found is that a lot of the times that's not happening. Maybe you're killing it at 1, but to nail all 4 is really a feat in itself. And that's just because, we're all humans, right? At the end of the day, making 11 to 15 touches on hundreds of leads every month for one person is a bear in the way of, just the amount of time that takes. And so we were finding that we were only getting 1 or 2 attempts before people really gave up. We noticed that slow response times were really an issue. And so again, kind of touching back on the idea that we're all sitting behind a computer right now, we're all kind of demanding this sort of instant gratification in the way of follow-up when we reach out to somebody with a question, that slow response times are kind of like the killer of all deals, right? And so, we found that it took up to 9 hours for somebody to get back to us when, 9 hours is plenty of time for me behind a computer to go Google another option. And then I'm gone, right? So that's a big one. And then the last couple here, personalization and performance. I think it's really easy, especially when we're talking about, like just nurture emails, to just put a template together and say, okay, this is great. We're going to blast this out to everybody and hope for the best. That personalization is really important in, humanizing your interactions and really garnering a real response from somebody, because people can spot when you are sending them a form email or when you sound like a robot. And then lastly, and this is one that I think we don't really think about a lot, is where is that email even going? Google tries to help us now with all of these inboxes and all of these tabs and flags and all kinds of filters and things, which is nice, I guess, but it's easy for your email to get kind of like swept away into a black hole. And so we found actually that 12% of all of the companies that we reached out to actually ended up in our main inbox. And so that means that all of the other stuff, even if you nailed all 3 of those other Ps and you just crafted this magnificent email, if it doesn't land in front of the person, it's moot. It doesn't matter. So those 4 Ps are really important, and really they do kind of, we as marketers rely on sales and that like kind of human aspect to make all of these 4 Ps happen.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so now understanding what effective engagement really looks like, what's the role of nurture programs in an engagement strategy?
I think that nurture is really important still, but I think that we can't think about nurture as a driver of pipeline, I guess, like as a driver of like real opportunity conversion. Like there isn't like a point in a nurture journey where somebody clicks on something and magically becomes an op. Like that just doesn't happen. I wish
Don't we all?
Yeah. But we all understand though that there is a good, there is a role for nurture, and that role is brand awareness, and it's consistency in exposure, and it's delivering interesting, helpful content to your audience at the moment when they need it the most. And so we all have this, I think we all have this understanding of the buying journey, and we all have, our super intricate content matrices where we've mapped all of our content to each of the buying stages, and we look at people's behavior and try to deliver them their content, the relevant content at the right time. And that's all important, because that is the mechanism for understanding if somebody is a real human person who really does know who you are, who really might be ready to have a conversation with you, but it's not going to be the thing that actually drives the conversation. So I think from a brand awareness standpoint and a kind of like growing your database and growing the awareness within your database perspective, nurture and retargeting and all of these kind of like these sort of like middle of the funnel type marketing programs are really important. And they need to work together with something like conversational AI or a salesperson or something that actually drives a real conversation and not just an opportunity for somebody to like hit your website and become an MQL.
Yeah, and that's great. And it really tees up that next question, which is, how can conversational AI complement that investment?
Yeah, I think this is where the fun part comes in, especially as like an ops person, because we think about all of the different stages of the buying journey as they relate to also kind of like the sales and marketing process. So when a lead comes in the top, how does it move through the funnel and get over to sales? And then once it's over to sales, what happens to it in order for it to become a deal? And there are all of these little different steps that we can take, and we try to automate it as best we can to make it this seamless, magical process. And so there are a lot of ways that I think conversational AI can kind of fill in some of the gaps that we wish we could automate in some way or another, and we can't unless we've got some kind of conversational AI solution. So, for example, at the very top of the funnel, engaging with folks in real time at the top of the funnel, and then, for example, moving into like driving campaign engagement, right? So in a traditional world, I'm a demand gen person. I'm going to go out and I'm going to create my 2 to 3 email nurture track to invite somebody to a webinar. And I'm going to rely pretty much on probably that webinar nurture track, as well as maybe some social promotion, maybe some paid promotion to drive registration. But I'm really just kind of relying on you, the audience, to kind of like take it upon yourself to engage with that content and go register, right? Like I'm not really doing a lot to hold your hand and facilitate getting you to register and then show up for that webinar. And we do the thing where we try to enable sales and we say, here you go, here's the landing page, here's the unique URL, here are all these things that you need in order to follow up with people and make sure that they're coming to that webinar. But I'm going to say 90% of the time, a salesperson is not going to make time to help drive traffic to your webinar. They have more important things to do. And so how do you kind of like create that, right? Like that personalized outreach in tandem with your kind of like HTML brand awareness type emails that go out. And so this is a good example of a real kind of like program that is run at Conversica using conversational AI, where we've got, our 2 to 3 email, webinar invite track over a 3-week period. A lot of times we do see engagement with those emails in the way of opens and clicks, but we don't see the actual registrations come through. So people are opening the emails, they're clicking, they're visiting the landing page, and then they bounce. And that's a real bummer. And so what do? We just kind of keep sending them emails and hoping that they will eventually decide to register. But in this case, we use conversational AI to kind of trigger a more personalized outreach to try to sort of handhold the audience, the prospect, into actually registering for that webinar. And so in this case, we use our AI assistant to reach out the second that we see that an email was open, an invite email was open, but after 5 minutes or so, they didn't register. So our AI assistant reaches out and says, hey, we're having a webinar. We're really hoping you can join us. Let me know if you'd like to have the link. And now you've got kind of like a real person reaching out and saying, hey, we really want you to be there. Will you come? In this case, the lead responds and says yes, and then we send the link to the webinar and the registration occurs. Obviously, then we're kind of bouncing our engagement back into the marketing automation platform, and we send our email confirmation and all of that fun stuff. But then this is kind of a fun way to drive actual attendance on the webinar. So this is something that even during, COVID, we really experienced like high registration rates and low attendance rates, because I think we were all just personally burnt out on joining a bunch of webinars. And so, you want that information, but it's kind of like, oh, I'll just wait for the recording. But we really wanted to help drive people to actually like attend the webinar and be engaged on the webinar and ask questions, and feel like they could actually participate. And so we reach out again and we say, a few days before the webinar, and we say, hey, I noticed you're registered. We really want to make sure we get any of your questions answered. Do you have any questions that you'd like to make sure that you get answered on the webinar? The lead responds with a great question. And then we make sure that we get that added to the webinar. And we also ask to basically debrief after the webinar on whatever that question was that they asked, and set up time with sales. Kind of a softer ask. It's a nice way to get an ask in for a meeting pre-webinar, rather than kind of like waiting for the webinar to occur, hoping somebody attends, and then like having your SDRs like sick them, right? And then obviously we bounce back to our marketing automation platform. We send our reminder emails, and then we send our time to dial in emails. And so this is just kind of like a good example of conversational AI and kind of like your sort of traditional sort of, program working together to drive just better in participation. I don't even want to say engagement anymore. Better participation in your marketing programs and in your webinars and in your events, so that people are just like more actively participating rather than just kind of like passively being a name in your database and waiting for you to contact them with content.
Yeah. And I think what's really great is we're not putting any burden on the sales reps, the SDRs for this at all. It's all done, even though it feels very human-like and very dialogue-ish, it is not burdening the sales team. So that's great.
Yeah.
I think the other piece to note is that these are going on in tandem, right? So they're complementary and they work together. So they don't have to be done in a serial notion. So
yeah. And this is automated, right? So these are the pieces that as an ops person, I wish I could automate my SDR a little bit. I wish I could just like do it for him. And this kind of gives me that opportunity and also sort of sets up the SDR to be able to have like a real conversation prior to a webinar rather than just like hope, spraying and praying.
Exactly. One of the other things that we hear a lot is that organizations are really looking to increase the level of personalization, but they're having a really hard time doing that at scale. Is conversational AI the key to that?
I think it definitely helps. So kind of from a marketing ops standpoint, obviously, like we have all of these, doodads in place in our marketing automation platforms where we can sort of personalize our emails with tokens or placeholder content where we can say, we'll drop in their first name or we'll drop in the company or we'll drop in their title or something like that. But that's a little dangerous when you get a little crazy with it because you're pulling from your CRM and you're then relying on that information to be like 100% accurate. I don't know how many times I've seen an email that like, references my title and it's like in all caps or it's missing letters because I fat fingered it when I typed it into the form that I filled out. And so relying on just like tokens and calling that personalization, I don't think is really enough. I think also there's a huge burden in the way of actually setting up those emails and setting up that personalization because you're writing if I have a 5 email nurture track and I want it all to be super personalized, I have to write every single one of those emails from scratch, drop in all of the personalized pieces, test it, make sure it all runs in the timing that I want it to run. I mean, it's a whole process to make that
very
happen.
labor intensive.
Very labor intensive. And then on the sales side, if you want them to really use personalization, they have to go out and they've got to research and they've got to look the person up and figure out what they're doing and, write the email, which now we're relying on SDRs to write the emails and where, now all that burden's on them. And so at the end of the day, somebody has to pick up the slack for it. And it all seems a little silly. And so what ends up happening is it just doesn't happen.
Right.
And so the nice thing about Conversica specifically is this kind of concept of the conversation editor where, AI is really driving the contents of the emails. And so you've got like a 6 or 7 email track where, and the timing is all built in and all of those emails are really built using AI. Like I'm not actually going in and writing emails. I am, however, kind of pointing it in the right direction and giving it the context so that those emails make sense. So I'm able to insert in, kind of like all of the little missing pieces for the email, like the name of the event or the date of the event or, what piece of content they downloaded or something like that to be able to give the AI assistant like the context to put together a sentence that makes sense. And so then that's all sort of pre-done. You can preview all of it, make sure it all makes sense. And then you kind of like set it and let her fly. And she's just going to kind of come up with, emails as she goes based on, whatever the context of that you set her up with. And then also be able to respond, in turn. So if somebody is going to respond to an email like this, she's able to handle that response and then keep going back and forth. rather than if I were to send my beautiful tokenized, personalized email track and somebody did magically respond to it, which is like the dream, who's receiving that email? Me as an ops person or me as a demand gen person. And then I've got to go chase down sales and I've got to go do the thing. And I've got to go say, hey, like, here's a thing. And then I'm the AI assistant. I don't want to be the AI assistant. So, so I think just at like personalization and then scaling all of that is really hard to do when you're not using something like a conversational AI platform.
Well, and I think that's, that's kind of key around the scalability and using a AI assistant to kind of augment your existing workforce and manage capacity challenges and be able to do this persistently. You want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I have had the pleasure of managing an SDR team in the past. And capacity is a real thing. I mean, I think as marketers, we say, well, what's stopping you from following up with the 150 MQLs I gave you today and making it all beautiful and personalized and awesome? And why aren't you getting copious meetings from all of these leads I've given you? And the reality is, like, human people have a hard time, like, doing that. Like 150 emails that you've written from scratch every day, it's just like not possible. And so really what we want to do is be able to focus the SDRs and the sales team on having real conversations, and not trying to like drive somebody to, feel inclined to have a conversation with them. Like we want them to sell. And so, having an AI assistant in place does a lot in the way of air cover in a lot of different ways. Like one, if I have this like, a blank territory, like SDRs are a really high turnover team a lot of the time. They move up, they move on, they move out. If I've got holes in my team, I can use an AI assistant to kind of pick up the slack while I go find somebody else, or while I train somebody else, or whatever.
And they never take vacation.
They do not. And they also don't require snacks. And so if I've got that kind of like running in the background, I can really focus on making sure that my team, my SDR team, is trained up and they're effective and they know what they're doing and they're confident. And I'm not just like throwing them to the wolves and saying like, good luck, because I need you to just do this. I need the air cover. So I think it makes for better SDR teams, like stronger SDR teams, because they've essentially got an SDR, their own personal SDR as SDRs, which I think is like every sales development rep's dream, is to have like an assistant. And so that's kind of how I think about it. It's just being able to kind of like be the quarterback, I guess, for the rest of the SDR team and set them up so that they can really, get connections when they pick up the phone and they call somebody, rather than just like, going on about their day, making their 50 calls and going home.
Yep.
So
agreed. And that's really, a key piece of scalability, but where the rubber meets the road is really about results. And, here in Conversica, we actually track a couple of things, our engagement rate and our hot rate. And engagement means that they've actually had a dialogue with us, right? They've got a positive response. And hot means that they're actually ready to set up a meeting. So it's much more than an MQL. I mean, these are pretty high numbers, Amanda. I mean, talk about how these relate to the industry.
Yeah. So when we think about engagement rates, I think when we think about just kind of traditional engagement and clicks, let's just use clicks. If I've got like a 25% click rate on my emails, that's all fine and good. But how many of those are actually turning into meetings? I would say 0. And if you are doing it, God bless you. But like, I've never seen it happen. So when we say engaged in this context, and we mean somebody actually responded. It could be a negative response. It could be no, thank you, but I'll take a no, thank you over radio silence pretty much any day, because now I know what to do with you. I know to go put you somewhere else and hope that you'll come back around later, rather than just like screaming into the void. So I think engaged in this context is huge, because that's essentially a reply rate. And that reply rate, I think, even sort of blows out of the water a lot of like just sort of like SDR outreach type reply rates. And then from a hot perspective, that's basically saying that like out of your email programs or out of your outreach programs, you're generating, up to 6% of those turn into actual real meetings. Like that's pretty amazing. So for something that has such little lift that can have such a big impact, I think is huge. And then I think the last piece here is this kind of days to hot. We put people in nurture tracks that go out, those emails go out every week or every other week, and they could go out for 6 months straight. And maybe we never get them to be an MQL. Maybe they open emails over and over again, but they're never really engaged. But we, take that 6 months down to 11 days, and that's huge. And so that means that not only are you generating like a higher volume of qualified people for sales, you're also generating them faster. And so when velocity goes up, obviously pipeline goes up as well.
Yep, that's great. So as we get ready to kind of wrap this up, I just want to say that, we all understand that the one-on-one conversations deliver the best results. It's just really hard to consistently and cost effectively engage leads in every stage of the customer journey. And this is where conversational AI, and specifically the Conversica AI assistants, can help to augment your marketing and sales teams to deliver that personal engagement and at scale across the entire journey. We've covered an awful lot here today. I hope it was clear why organizations should start to consider conversations over clicks and how engagement changes as you move through the funnel. Amanda, you have any final thoughts before we wrap up the session?
No, I think, well, yes, of course. I always have thoughts. I think that one of the biggest things for me coming into working at Conversica and then, like using the actual tool and thinking about it, I came from a background where, demand gen is demand gen, and we do the nurtures and we do the campaigns, and that's what we do. And then we hand off the leads. And I think that there's so much opportunity to use conversational AI to not only, generate better pipeline and more pipeline for sales, but also create way more interesting and engaging experiences for your audience, which ultimately is going to be what drives demand. It's not necessarily generating leads and pushing them through the funnel and calling that a win. I think it's really like genuinely about creating good experiences for your audience so that they are really kind of attached to your brand and they want to work with you versus you just kind of like moving them along based on this kind of like arbitrary framework that you've put in place. So I think that would be kind of my final thought, is just think about demand gen and think about the tools that you're using as a mechanism to create really positive experiences for your audience. And then the rest sort of comes.
Great point. Really appreciate your time today. Thank you, Amanda, for joining me. Don't forget to check out some of the solutions we have on Conversica.com. Thank you for your time.
Thanks.